She was 7 barefoot and invisible until she moved one chess piece in a billionaire's boardroom and exposed a secret no one was supposed to remember. At precisely 6:17 a.m., the cleaning crew arrived at Whitaker Labs, a glass-paneled building that rose like a modern sculpture against the soft hills of Ash Hollow, Kentucky. June Harper, quiet and focused, pushed her supply cart down the polished corridor like she had every weekday morning for 7 years. But today, something was different. As she reached the executive boardroom to dust the shelves and wipe down the walnut table, she noticed her 7-year-old daughter, Lily May, standing silently by the far end of the room. Her eyes, wide and thoughtful, were fixed not on the high-backed leather chairs or the panoramic windows, but on the old chessboard sitting beneath the glass display case. Without asking, without hesitation, Lily reached up, slid one piece forward, and whispered, "Knight to e5." What she couldn't know was that the board hadn't been touched in over a decade, and the move she'd made completed a sequence that only one man in the building had ever solved. That single moment, quiet, unplanned, and precise, was the beginning of everything. Whitaker Labs stood like a crown of glass and steel at the edge of Ash Hollow, Kentucky, a town built on coal and slowly shifting towards something new, something uncertain. The lab was a symbol of progress, of the town's leap from soot to circuitry, but most residents still walked with the weight of old industries on their shoulders. Early every morning before the executives arrived in their pressed suits and electric cars, a different kind of workforce entered through the back doors, quiet, invisible, and essential. Among them was June Harper, a single mother who cleaned offices before sunrise and picked up her daughter Lily May from her neighbor's house just before school. But on this particular Monday, with her sitter out sick, and no other choice, June brought Lily with her. The little girl didn't complain. She never did. With oversized headphones around her neck and a tattered notebook tucked under one arm, she followed her mother like a shadow through the hallways of innovation and silent ambition. June gave her clear instructions: sit here. Don't touch anything. But Lily, curious and calm, soon drifted toward the executive boardroom, an expansive chamber with a long walnut table, chrome chairs, and a wall of windows that poured pale morning light across the floor. At the far end of the room, behind a pane of glass, rested a vintage chessboard. Dust clung to the corners, and the pieces were arranged mid-game, frozen in tension. Lily stepped closer, pressing her small fingers against the glass, her eyes scanning the board with the quiet intensity of someone who wasn't merely observing, but remembering. Then, without a word, she slid open the case, reached in, and moved a black knight to e5. It was an elegant move, unexpected, dangerous, and precise. She didn't know that she'd just completed the final step of a problem abandoned years ago by the company's founder, nor did she notice the quiet figure watching her from the doorway. Caleb Whitaker himself, frozen in place, staring at the child who had just cracked the ghost of a game no one had dared to finish. Lily May Harper was 7 years old and had never once been late to school, not because someone drove her there in a fancy car or packed her backpack with organic snacks, but because her mother June believed in showing up no matter what. Lily was the kind of child who listened more than she spoke, whose eyes wandered to things most adults ignored: cracks in the ceiling, the hum of vending machines, the shape of clouds on linoleum floors. She'd learned early that silence kept you safe, that blending in kept you invisible, and that sometimes when your mom worked 2 shifts and your shoes had holes in the soles, being invisible was better than being noticed. But Lily wasn't ordinary, not really. Hidden beneath her quiet was a mind that absorbed everything: books discarded at the laundromat, overheard words from engineers walking past the cleaning closet, the shape of numbers carved into steel elevator panels. What she loved most, though, was patterns. She saw them in the way people walked, how her mother folded rags, even in the broken floor tiles at the corner of the Whitaker Labs cafeteria. But chess was something else entirely. She had seen it first in an old book someone had left at the bus stop bench, water-stained and missing a cover. She took it home and taught herself how the pieces moved. Not just the rules, but the strategy, the rhythm, the dance. At night, while June fell asleep from exhaustion, Lily played silently on a makeshift board drawn on cardboard bottle caps for pawns. She never told anyone. Not because she was ashamed, but because no one had ever asked. That Monday morning when she stepped into the boardroom and saw the old chessboard beneath the glass, it didn't feel like the first time. It felt like memory, like something that had been waiting. So she moved the night without hesitation, not as a guess, but as a truth. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She didn't even know anyone was watching. She was just finishing the pattern. Caleb Whitaker hadn't planned to come in early that morning, but a restless night and an unfinished board presentation pulled him from his bed before dawn. As CEO of Whitaker Labs and heir to the company's legacy, he often walked the halls before the rest of the world stirred, using the silence to think. That morning, as he stepped into the executive wing, coffee in one hand and laptop bag slung over his shoulder, he paused, his eyes catching on a small figure standing motionless at the far end of the boardroom. At first, he thought it was a statue, a shadow, perhaps a technician's child who had wandered too far. But then she moved, slowly, deliberately. She reached out her hand, slid open the protective glass, and touched the chessboard. His chessboard. A relic from his father's office, the board had remained untouched since the day Thomas Whitaker died. It was part memorial, part riddle. No one had ever solved the configuration he'd left behind 38 moves deep into a theoretical endgame his father had once claimed held a perfect conclusion. But Caleb had tried. He'd spent years revisiting the board, late nights, sleepless holidays, always stopping at the same impasse until he eventually gave up, leaving the board sealed like a grave. So when he saw the girl, tiny, barefoot, wearing a hoodie 3 sizes too big, reach in and place the black knight on e5, something in him froze. Not fear, not anger, something older, a thrum in his chest like recognition. Why that move, he asked, his voice careful low. The girl didn't flinch. She didn't even look up at first. Then with a voice so soft it barely stirred the air, she said, "Because it's the only one that doesn't lose." She turned her head. Then, not startled, not apologetic, just calm. He wanted to trap the queen but not sacrifice the bishop. You can't do both unless the knight blocks the diagonal. Caleb stepped closer, heart pounding, staring at the board. She was right. It was the key. After all these years. The move. And this girl, this silent child in worn sneakers, had just broken the code without even trying. Caleb Whitaker couldn't stop thinking about the girl. After that morning, her name kept circling his thoughts like an unfinished sentence, Lily Mae Harper. He asked HR, discreetly combed through security logs, and finally traced her to the cleaning staff roster under the name of her mother, June Harper. A janitor, temporary hire, no benefits, no medical plan, no mention of a child. He kept the discovery to himself, unsure what unsettled him more, the brilliance of the chess move or the quiet certainty in her voice. Over the next few days, Caleb found himself arriving early, walking the halls not for strategy but for glimpses of the girl who had solved what no engineer in his building had managed to touch. She never sought attention. She stayed close to her mother, quiet, alert, always watching. But once he caught her staring at a schematic on the wall, one of the lab's patent diagrams. Her eyes tracked the circuit paths with more focus than most graduate interns. On instinct, Caleb pulled strings, nothing too obvious. He invited June to a staff appreciation lunch and made sure she brought Lily. There, in a quiet moment between speeches, he handed Lily a tablet with a logic puzzle app. She solved the first one in 43 seconds, the second in 30, the 10th in under 10. When he asked her how, she shrugged and said, "They repeat. People don't notice the patterns, but they do." That night, he sent a confidential inquiry to a cognitive researcher at Stanford, attaching anonymized transcripts of Lily's answers. The response came in under 2 hours. This is not normal. This is prodigious. The more Caleb learned, the more disturbed he became, not by Lily's abilities, but by her circumstances. She was 7, living in a 1-bedroom apartment behind the old hardware store, no access to books beyond what she could find in dumpsters or borrow illegally from the library without a card, no stable school enrollment, no laptop, no mentors. The world had labeled her as poor, not gifted, as invisible, not essential. And for the first time in years, Caleb Whitaker, a man who built machines to predict the future, felt something uncalculated take root: responsibility. Not as a CEO, not even as a philanthropist, as a man who had seen something undeniable and couldn't look away. June Harper had spent her entire life learning how to stay invisible, and she had every intention of teaching her daughter the same. Life had not been kind to women like her single, underpaid cleaning offices before dawn, living paycheck to paycheck in a town that barely remembered her name. So when Mr. Whitaker, the CEO himself, asked her to stay behind after her shift for a quick word, her heart sank. She immediately assumed the worst. Maybe Lily had touched something she shouldn't have. Maybe she'd offended someone important. But Caleb Whitaker didn't fire her. He asked questions about Lily, about her schooling, about how long they'd been in Ash Hollow. He was polite, too polite, which only made June more suspicious. She had seen enough of men in power to know that kindness could be a mask. When he offered a scholarship for Lily to attend a nearby STEM program, June's first instinct was to say no, flatly, without hesitation. "We're fine," she told him, trying to keep her voice even. But something in his eyes didn't feel like charity. It felt like curiosity edged with awe. That unnerved her even more. June had always known there was something different about her daughter. From the time Lily was 3, she could remember exact pages of books even if she couldn't read them yet. By 5, she could recite entire conversations from memory map routes through the neighborhood with her eyes closed and find hidden objects by instinct. She didn't speak much, but when she did, her words often cut straight to truth, no matter how uncomfortable. June had done her best to protect that brilliance, to keep it from being used, mocked, or turned into something ugly. She had seen what the world did to poor children who didn't know their place. But now this man with a glass tower and a chessboard seemed to see it too, and that scared her. Because if someone like him noticed Lily, the world might start paying attention. And June wasn't sure if that would save her daughter or destroy her. So she nodded, thanked him cautiously, and walked away, gripping Lily's hand tighter than usual, as if to remind the world and herself that Lily belonged to her and no one else. Caleb Whitaker had always believed in systems, algorithms, architecture, hierarchy. Everything in his company operated like a clean circuit board, precise and predictable. But ever since Lily Mae Harper had stood in his boardroom and made that impossibly perfect move on the chessboard, something in him had shifted. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was a growing awareness that genius often bloomed in forgotten places, in overlooked corners, and this little girl from the janitor's shadow might be the most brilliant anomaly he'd ever encountered. So after reviewing every possible way to avoid overstepping boundaries or causing suspicion, he decided on something simple: an invitation. Whitaker Labs had recently launched a casual weekly chess workshop on Friday afternoons, open to employees and their children, as a way to encourage strategic thinking and decompress after a long work week. It was low stakes, mostly marketing fluff, but now it had a purpose. Caleb drafted the invitation himself, bypassing the events team, and handed it to June in person. "We're hosting a chess hour for kids," he said carefully, holding out the crisp envelope like it was made of glass. "No pressure. Just come by. Bring Lily, if she wants." June looked at it, as if it might explode in her hand. Her eyes narrowed. "You want my daughter to come play games with engineers and interns?" she asked, her voice tight. Caleb nodded gently. "Only if she wants to. No uniforms, no interviews. Just a board. Just a game." He left it at that. That Friday, just as the room was beginning to fill with awkward dads and their overly enthusiastic sons, Lily stepped through the door, her small hand clenched in her mother's, her expression unreadable. She scanned the room, found the tournament board, and sat without a word. Her first opponent, a junior analyst who boasted about winning regionals in college, laughed politely and shook her hand. 6 moves later, he was staring at the board like it had betrayed him. Caleb watched from the corner, saying nothing, but the corner of his mouth twitched. It was beginning. Not just a game, but a shift, one quiet move at a time. From a quiet bench tucked into the far corner of the company's rec hall, Ernest Doyle watched the chess room unfold, with the silent precision of a man who'd spent decades observing people who thought they were smarter than they were. Ernest wasn't on payroll anymore. He'd retired 3 years ago, or at least that's what the company insisted on calling it. But they let him come back every Friday for the chess club he'd started long before Whitaker Labs was a household name. He wasn't there for show. He was there because patterns fascinated him, moves, mistakes, momentum. And today, something shattered the usual pattern. Her name was Lily. She didn't speak, didn't twitch, didn't gloat, just played. Moved pieces like they weren't wooden objects but living things whispering directions. She didn't fidget, didn't wait, didn't hesitate. Ernest had seen good players, great ones even. But what Lily had wasn't talent. It was clarity, the kind that came along once in a generation, maybe less. He tilted his old wool cap down and leaned forward, just slightly pretending to study the board behind her. But he was watching every micro-movement she made, the way her eyes flicked, the way her fingers hovered, the way she seemed to know the moment a game was lost, even when her opponent hadn't figured it out yet. Most kids her age moved with hunger or pride. She moved like someone solving a riddle already answered in her head. Ernest had a granddaughter once years ago. Smart too, but lost in a system that didn't know what to do with her. He had made peace with that pain, or so he thought, until he saw Lily, until he felt that old ache of urgency crawl up his spine. After her third victory this time, against an assistant engineer who left the room red-faced, Ernest stood up, walked over and said only one thing. "You don't play like a child." Lily blinked. "That's because I'm not." She replied softly, her voice dry and plain as if stating the weather. Ernest nodded. He didn't ask her anything else. He just walked back to his bench, sat down, and pulled out a small notebook. And in it he wrote 3 words, underlined twice, "Watch this girl." By the 3rd Friday, the whispers had begun. Not loud, not disruptive, just quiet currents of disbelief that swirled through the halls of Whitaker Labs, like a breeze before a storm. Lily Mae Harper, the janitor's daughter, the girl who never spoke, unless she had something absolutely necessary to say, was winning. Not just squeaking by with lucky moves or fluke victories, she was dismantling opponents piece by piece, game after game. Her name hadn't been on the sign-up sheet the first week, but now it was etched into everyone's attention whether she wrote it down or not. Senior engineers came early to get a board before the room filled up. Junior developers whispered behind their lattes, debating whether she was a savant or just some eerie kid with too much time and a photographic memory. But those who sat across from her knew the truth. It wasn't memory. It was vision. She didn't memorize the past. She saw what was coming. Caleb Whitaker watched her 4th consecutive win against a seasoned strategy manager with 20 years of experience in operations. The man had come in cocky, even laughed when someone whispered, "You're up against the girl." But within 12 minutes he was hunched over the board, frowning deeper with each passing second, trapped in a rook and bishop net he never saw coming. When Lily calmly said checkmate and stood up without fanfare, the room held its breath. No one clapped. No one cheered. It wasn't that kind of victory. It was surgical, clinical cold. But there was something else too. Something warm underneath. A flicker in her eyes, like she wasn't winning to win. She was solving something. A puzzle the rest of them couldn't see. Caleb didn't know how to explain it. But every time Lily sat down, the room felt different, as if the rules of the game changed slightly, bent toward her quiet gravity. Even Ernest Doyle, who had once beaten a regional champion blindfolded, hadn't dared challenge her yet. He just sat, observed, scribbled in his leather-bound notebook, like a monk chronicling a miracle. Lily's mother June sometimes peeked through the crack of the door, unsure whether to feel proud, scared, or both. But Lily didn't seem fazed. She'd come in, sit down, and play. And then, without saying a word, she'd leave. Not once had she asked to keep a trophy. Not once had she smiled at a win, as if the real game was still waiting to begin. On a damp Thursday morning, with the sky above Ash Hollow smeared in gray, and the smell of rain still clinging to the pavement outside Whitaker Labs, Ernest Doyle finally stepped forward. He had been watching her for weeks now, always seated in the back, fingers clasped over his cane, a worn leather notebook resting quietly on his lap. Some thought he was a retired janitor. Others whispered he was some kind of eccentric investor. Very few knew the truth that Ernest Doyle was once ranked among the top 20 chess players in the world, a former grandmaster who'd vanished from the tournament scene after a scandalous loss and a quiet retirement nearly 20 years ago. But now something about the girl had stirred him from his long hibernation. At exactly 10:32 a.m., as Lily Mae Harper finished her fourth match of the morning, Doyle rose. He didn't say a word. He simply approached the board where Lily was resetting the pieces, pulled out the old wooden chair across from her, and sat down with the gravity of a man about to witness either the end of an illusion or the beginning of something rare. The room fell into silence, every conversation drying up like rain on a hot skillet. Caleb Whitaker leaned forward, just slightly, eyes narrowed. Even June, who was sweeping near the door, stopped mid-motion. Lily looked up at Doyle with her usual calm, not blinking, not smiling. She simply nodded once. He nodded back. Then the game began. The first three moves were classical Queen's Gambit accepted. The fourth and fifth moved quickly. By the sixth, Doyle hesitated. By the seventh, his brow furrowed. On the eighth, he leaned back, muttered something unintelligible, and adjusted his knight. On the ninth move, Lily gently slid her bishop to c4 and quietly said, "Mate, in 2. You can resign, or we can finish." Her voice was soft, almost tender, but firm, unshaken. Doyle stared at the board for a long moment. Then, with an audible sigh, he tipped over his king. The gasp that spread through the room felt like a shift in the air pressure. It wasn't just that Lily had won, it was how she won. 9 moves, no hesitation, and against a man who had once stood on global stages with legends. Doyle stood slowly, eyes studying her face, not in defeat, but in reverence. "You're not just a prodigy," he said, his voice raspy with something close to awe. "You're the reason prodigies exist." Then he turned and walked out, leaving behind a stunned silence, and a girl who still hadn't smiled. Later that afternoon, long after the echoes of gasps and disbelief had faded from the company rec room where Lily had defeated Ernest Doyle in just 9 moves, Caleb Whitaker found the old man standing alone on the rooftop terrace of Whitaker Labs, overlooking the slow-moving Ohio River in the distance. The air was cool, stirred by a gentle breeze that tousled the graying hair at Doyle's temple. Caleb approached cautiously, expecting congratulations or perhaps analysis of the match. But before he could speak, Ernest turned to him, his face grave and voice low. "That girl," he said without preamble, "doesn't need more games or drills or trophies. She doesn't need to be taught chess. She already speaks it more fluently than any grandmaster I've ever met." Caleb frowned slightly, trying to understand where this was going. Doyle looked out over the hills and added, "What she needs now is someone who knows how to keep the world from taking her apart." That silenced Caleb. He'd built an empire on logic, innovation, and strategic intuition, but he hadn't been prepared for that sentence. "Come again?" Caleb asked finally. Ernest sighed, then turned to face him fully. Prodigies like her true prodigies don't slip through the cracks because they're invisible. They get pulled out and paraded around like carnival tricks. The press, the sponsors, the recruiters, the predators. And once they're used up, once their genius is measured and mined, they're discarded. Brilliant, broken, and alone. He paused, the weight of his years pressing into every syllable. She doesn't need to learn how to play the game better. She needs someone who will protect her from what the game becomes when men in suits start to circle. Caleb felt the truth of that land in his chest like a stone. He thought of Lily's steady eyes, the way she didn't flinch even when facing Doyle, the way she walked into a room without seeking attention, yet commanded it anyway. She wasn't chasing brilliance. She was brilliance, unshaped, unsheltered. Doyle leaned in closer. "If you want to help her, don't turn her into a symbol. Turn her into a person who gets to choose what kind of life she wants to live." Then, with nothing else, the old man walked past Caleb and disappeared down the stairwell, leaving the CEO of Whitaker Labs standing in silence, heart-pounding, with a child genius downstairs who had just rewritten every rule he thought he understood. At exactly 8:03 a.m., On a brisk Tuesday morning, the doors of the Whitaker Labs executive elevator slid open on the 12th floor with a mechanical sigh, and Lorraine Benson stepped out clad in her signature steel-gray blazer heels that clicked like punctuation marks and a glare sharp enough to cut glass. Her eyes scanned the hallway like a hawk circling a field until they landed on something, or rather, someone that made her pause mid-stride. There, just outside the conference room, where department heads were due to meet, sat a girl no older than 7. Barefoot as always, her wild brown curls half tamed by a ribbon quietly examining a laminated floor plan, with such focused intensity, it could have been a chessboard. Lorraine's face froze, then shifted into polite revulsion. Why, she said icily to the assistant trailing her, is the janitor's child sitting outside our executive briefing? The assistant stammered something about an enrichment program Caleb had approved, that the girl had shown exceptional ability, that Mr. Whitaker himself had invited her to the employee chess sessions. Lorraine didn't even blink. Exceptional ability. This is a corporate innovation lab, not a daycare, she snapped. The optics of this are appalling. A barefoot child whose mother cleans the floors wandering around high-security zones like she owns the place. What are we signaling to our investors exactly? That we're running a charity for prodigies in mop buckets. She strode past Lily without acknowledgement, entering the conference room in a storm cloud of perfume power and well-disguised contempt. Her voice could still be heard as she took her seat, sharply questioning whether company resources were being appropriately allocated and whether Mr. Whitaker had formally cleared this initiative with the board. Elsewhere, Lily, unbothered, slowly turned over the floor plan, having memorized every room on that floor already. But Caleb, arriving just minutes later, heard enough of Lorraine's comments to feel a cold ripple of warning run down his spine. Lorraine Benson wasn't just another executive. She was a legacy board member with old money political ties and the uncanny ability to wield policy like a scalpel. If she'd set her sights on Lily as a problem, it meant trouble wasn't coming. It had already arrived. And Caleb, for all his foresight, wasn't sure if even he could outmaneuver a woman who'd once tanked an entire merger because she didn't like the CEO's wife. In the days that followed, Lily Mae Harper's improbable rise through Whitaker Labs' chess program, the whispers began not within the walls of the company, but outside in Ash Hollow's narrow streets and gas station corners, in the plastic chairs at Dixie's Diner, where tired parents nursed coffee and scraped together pride. What started as harmless curiosity isn't that June Harper's little girl soon twisted into suspicion. It began with a single post on the Ash Hollow community board, accompanied by a blurry photo of Lily walking beside CEO Caleb Whitaker in the corporate atrium. 7 years old and already playing with the top brass, someone wrote, "Wish my kid had a janitor for a mom and a golden ticket." Comments piled on. "My son's been waiting months to join the after-school STEM program, but this barefoot genius gets fast-tracked. Funny how talent always shows up when someone important takes notice. Let's just call it what it is. Favoritism." By the end of the week, the gossip had made it to school pickup lines and grocery checkout counters, where grown adults debated the ethics of a child's opportunities as if it were a town referendum. Some said it was inspiring a rare story of brilliance shining through circumstance. But others, especially those whose own children struggled for attention in overcrowded classrooms, saw it differently. Envy disguised itself as concern. "Are there background checks for this kind of thing?" one mother asked at a PTA meeting. "What if it's unsafe for her to be in those corporate spaces?" Another added, not unkindly, but with a sharpness that left a mark. A man who worked nights at the plant grumbled that the company was just trying to polish its diversity image with a charity case. At church, someone asked June quietly, carefully, if she really thought it was good for a girl like that to be spending so much time with executives. June didn't answer. She just packed up the hymnals and left before the benediction. But Lily noticed. She noticed when other kids stopped sitting next to her on the bus. She noticed when her teacher's praise felt more cautious, more measured, like it might offend someone. And Caleb noticed too when his inbox filled with concerns when the board requested a review of non-employee access policies. The very gift that had opened doors for Lily now threatened to push them shut, not because she was unworthy, but because the world had never learned to welcome brilliance from the broom closet. June Harper stood in the break room of Whitaker Labs with her arms crossed tightly across her chest, her cleaning gloves still damp and the scent of bleach clinging to her uniform. Her voice trembled, not from weakness, but from a fury held in for too long as she faced Caleb Whitaker, who had just come down from the executive floor concern written all over his face. "I want her out." June said each word sharp as broken glass. "No more chess classes, no more boardrooms, no more experiments." Caleb blinked, startled. "June, no one's experimenting on Lily. She's—" But June cut him off. "Don't," she said. "Don't tell me this is for her own good. I know how this goes. First they clap when the poor kid does something clever. Then they whisper. Then they tear her down, call her ungrateful, say we didn't belong in the first place. I've cleaned those conference rooms, Mr. Whitaker. I've emptied those trash bins full of judgment. I know what they say when they think the help isn't listening." Her voice cracked, then just a little, and she turned away, staring out the narrow window overlooking the parking lot where Lily was sitting on the curb tracing a knight's move in the dirt with her finger. "She's 7," June said softly. "She still sleeps with the blanket my mama quilted. She still asks if the moon gets cold at night. And now there are grown folks in this town acting like she's a threat because she knows how to move a pawn." Caleb took a step forward, his voice gentle. "She's brilliant, June. I've never seen anything like her. And she's not a pawn. She's a queen waiting to be placed on the board." June turned back to him, her eyes fierce. "You think I don't know that," she whispered. "You think I don't see what's in her, but brilliance doesn't protect you from being used, or from being hated for being different. You can't give her the world and then promise it won't break her. I don't want your kindness if it means putting my daughter in the crosshairs of people who smile to your face and spit when I turn my back." Caleb stood silent, the weight of her words sinking in. June gathered her gloves and rag, her hands shaking. "I don't need anyone to save her," she said. "I need people to stop pretending that lifting her up won't also tear something else down. I won't let her be your lesson or your project or your redemption arc. I just want her to be safe. And right now, that doesn't include here." At first, no one noticed she was gone. The chess room at Whitaker Labs was humming with the low, polite murmur of adult voices, pieces clicking gently on wood, the subtle scrape of chairs shifting, and Ernest Doyle's deep voice breaking through occasionally with instruction or encouragement. But there was one board left untouched. The chair was empty, the pieces perfectly arranged, waiting. Lily Mae Harper, always the first to arrive and the last to leave, was missing. Ernest was the first to realize, glancing at the clock on the wall, then at the doorway, expecting her small frame to appear with that silent focus in her eyes and the familiar pink hoodie she wore every Thursday. 10 more minutes passed, then 20. The air began to shift. Caleb Whitaker had stepped into the back of the room that day, unannounced, standing quietly with his arms folded as he often did when he wanted to observe without interrupting. He noticed the unease ripple through the room. Then he noticed the chair. "Where's Lily?" he asked, his voice calm but already tight with worry. No one answered. June hadn't brought her. That was clear now. Ernest slowly set down the rook he had been holding and reached for his phone, fingers shaking slightly, though he kept his voice level. "Let me check with June," he said, but the call went straight to voicemail. A second, a third. By the time the fourth went unanswered, Caleb was already moving through the hallway calling for Marlene at reception. "Have you seen June Harper? Or her daughter?" he asked. Marlene shook her head. "Not since Tuesday," she said, but..." She looked upset. Caleb didn't wait. He left the building, crossed the employee parking lot, where June's old Corolla was noticeably absent, and stood still under the gray Kentucky sky, heart pounding. His mind raced back to their last conversation, the one where June's voice shook, and she said she didn't want her daughter becoming anyone's project. He had meant to call her that night to assure her, but he hadn't. Now she and Lily were gone. Ernest checked with the HR office. No one had submitted resignation paperwork. No sick leave. Nothing. It was as if June had simply erased herself, and her daughter. The news spread through the company quickly in whispers and darting glances. Lorraine Benson raised an eyebrow in a board meeting and said, "I suppose the novelty wore off with a small smirk, but Caleb silenced her with a glance that made her fold her hands and retreat into silence. Meanwhile, Caleb had already sent 2 team members to check local shelters, schools, and the library downtown. No one had seen Lily. The town of Ash Hollow wasn't large, but it had enough corners, enough empty trailers, enough forgotten alleys where people could disappear without trace. Ernest, though slow and aching in the knees, drove across town to the park near the old train station where Lily had once beaten him in just 8 moves under the cottonwood tree. The swing creaked in the wind. Her initials LMH were still faintly scratched into the wood, but she wasn't there. That night, Caleb stood alone in his office overlooking the parking lot, the chessboard Lily had touched still on the conference table behind him. A pawn sat slightly out of place. He picked it up, turned it in his fingers, and whispered, "Where did you go, little queen?" There was no answer. Only silence, thick and cold, and a growing ache in his chest that he hadn't expected to feel for a child who had barely spoken more than 10 words to him. But somehow she had carved her way into this place, into him, and now she was gone. Caleb Whitaker sat alone in his office long after the lights had dimmed across Whitaker Labs, the hum of machines replaced by the soft pulse of his own thoughts, erratic and loud in the silence. He stared at the chessboard still resting on the table near the window, the pawn still cradled in his palm, the seat across from him painfully empty. Lily's absence had created a silence deeper than the room itself, a silence that clung to the edges of everything, making him feel like a man who had knocked over a fragile sculpture he had no right to touch. He had always prided himself on his detachment, his precision, his ability to draw hard lines between his personal life and his professional obligations. He had learned the art of controlled distance long ago, believing it kept people safe from his schedule, from his ambition, from the whirlwind of his own loneliness. But then a child in a pink hoodie had wandered into his world, rearranged the pieces on a board, and left something behind in the space where her silence met his. He had not gone looking for connection. He had only intended to offer opportunity, a quiet gesture of support for a prodigy who in another world might never be seen. But now that gesture felt like a crack that had grown into a fracture. He kept asking himself the question that wouldn't let him sleep. Had he stepped too far into a life he didn't belong in? Had his attention, no matter how well-meaning, placed Lily and her mother under a spotlight they didn't ask for, drawing eyes, envy, suspicion? Had his silence toward June Harper when she voiced her concern been interpreted as indifference or worse, entitlement? Did Lily disappear because of him? The thought wrapped itself around his chest like iron. He could remember the look in June's eyes the last time they spoke. Not anger, not gratitude, just a weariness laced with fear, like a woman who had seen too many open hands snatched back the moment they were needed most. And maybe she had looked at him and thought, "You won't stay either. You'll leave like the rest." Maybe June had decided to leave first, before her daughter got attached to a world that didn't know how to hold her gently. And the truth was, Caleb didn't know if he could have stayed. Not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know how. He didn't know how to build something personal that wasn't tied to quarterly goals or strategic projections. He had offered Lily a classroom, but he hadn't offered her protection. He had admired her gift, but he hadn't asked what she needed. And now in the stillness, he understood something Ernest had tried to say, but that Caleb hadn't grasped in the moment. This child didn't need more lessons. She needed someone who wouldn't walk away. And now that she had, Caleb felt the weight of that absence press against every inch of his life, making the office feel like a mausoleum of missed chances. The hardest part was not knowing whether it was too late to make it right, or if he even had the right to try. The Bluegrass Civic Hall wasn't much to look at from the outside. Just a squat red brick building tucked between an aging grocery outlet and an empty lot where wildflowers stubbornly bloomed in the cracks. But inside it pulsed with quiet tension and the crisp rhythm of chess clocks ticking down seconds. Folding chairs were lined in imperfect rows, the scent of instant coffee and musty carpet hanging faintly in the air, and at the back of the room beside a bulletin board covered with faded flyers. June Harper sat silently, her coat pulled tightly around her knees, as she watched her daughter move with eerie calm between tables. Lily didn't smile, didn't fidget. She simply played her small hands hovering for a moment above the board, then placing pieces with precision that made adults blink twice. There had been no press release, no announcement, no outreach to Caleb Whitaker or Whitaker Labs. June hadn't answered Caleb's messages, hadn't returned the letter he'd sent with the check folded inside a check she had shredded without opening fully. What her daughter needed, she decided, wasn't spectacle. It was space to breathe, to belong in her own name, not as someone's project or potential headline. She had registered Lily under her full name, Lily Mae Harper, and sat with her through the early matches in silence. Nobody there cared that she was the janitor's daughter. The Bluegrass Civic Hall didn't run on politics or boardroom whispers. It ran on mismatched clocks, worn-out boards, and a handful of retired teachers and veterans who had played every weekend for decades. In the first match, Lily dismantled a high school senior in under 20 moves. In the second, she quietly cornered a local librarian who had once gone to state championships. By the fourth match, people had stopped talking between rounds. The room shifted subtly from polite interest to cautious awe. Even the old-timers who'd come in just to relive their glory days began to lean in when she moved. A whisper started circling. "That Harper girl. She's something else." But June never moved from her seat. She didn't cheer. She didn't explain. She simply watched with her fingers laced so tightly in her lap they turned white. Every instinct in her body screamed to keep her daughter safe and visible, but here was Lily, unmistakably visible and unflinchingly brilliant. And the truth was, June hadn't meant to bring her. She had resisted for days, even as Lily stared at the flyer taped outside the laundromat. "It's not for us," she'd said. "It's not our world." But Lily had placed her hand over the printed words and looked at her, not pleading, not arguing, just waiting. So June folded as mothers sometimes do and arrived at the Civic Hall before dawn with a bag of crackers and a sweater and no idea what would happen. She didn't tell anyone, not because she was ashamed, but because she didn't want anyone interfering. If her daughter was going to shine, she wanted it to happen here quietly under no spotlight, but the one her own mind created with every impossible move. And as the final match approached Lily against the reigning local champion, a man 5 times her age with a beard like a storm cloud, June's throat tightened. She wasn't afraid her daughter would lose. She was afraid she wouldn't. Because what came next after the win was always the dangerous part. The part where people noticed and wanted something and claimed something. And June wasn't sure if she could hold off the world a second time. No one at the Bluegrass Civic Hall had planned for a live stream. There were no tripods, no microphones, no professional lighting, just a shaky smartphone held by an 8th grader named Marcus Bell, who had come to watch his cousin compete and was now staring slack-jawed at the tiny girl in a hand-me-down sweater dismantling the local chess champion like it was a slow, graceful demolition. Out of boredom or instinct, Marcus opened a streaming app tapped "Go Live" and angled his phone toward the final match. The image was grainy, the angle crooked, but the focus was clear. Lily Mae Harper, barely tall enough to see across the table, sitting upright with a focus that burned through the screen. At first, a handful of his friends tuned in, half-joking, dropping emojis, not sure what they were watching. "Who's the kid?" someone typed. "Some janitor's daughter," another replied. But within 5 minutes, the mood shifted. Something about Lily's quiet intensity, the way her hand hovered for just one breath before each move drew people in. The comments started piling up. "Wait, is this real? She's 7. Did she just sacrifice her bishop like that on purpose?" One viewer clipped a moment when Lily leaned back and tapped the clock with the calm confidence of someone who wasn't hoping to win, she knew she already had. That 10-second clip was screen-recorded, reposted on TikTok, retweeted with the caption, "Tiny Queen, Big Brain," and within 30 minutes the live stream swelled from 20 viewers to over 5,000. Then 12,000, then 50,000. By the time Lily cornered her opponent's king in a brilliant endgame maneuver using a rook she had seemingly left vulnerable 3 turns earlier, the internet had already chosen its next obsession. Tweets flew, "Where is Ash Hollow? And how do we adopt this kid?" I'd lay down my ego and lose to her with pride. Even a former national chess champion commented, "This girl sees 12 moves ahead. I want her on my team." back in the Civic Hall no one knew. The signal inside was weak, and June didn't own a smartphone. Lily focused entirely on the board, never looked up. She didn't know she was trending. She didn't know people were calling her the Pawn Whisperer or Kentucky's Queen. She didn't know a retired grandmaster in New York had just DM'd a clip to a recruiter at the U.S. Chess Federation with the message, "Find her. Now." The only clue came from Marcus, whose phone began buzzing uncontrollably in his lap, until he glanced down, saw the exploding numbers, and mouthed, "Holy crap." Even as the match ended, her opponent extending a hand with a thin-lipped smile and the stunned applause starting to ripple across the room, Lily only blinked once, then turned to look for her mother. June stood frozen at the back, torn between pride and panic, not yet aware of the storm brewing outside those walls. In a matter of minutes, what was supposed to be a quiet, anonymous test of skill had become a global headline in the making. And Lily Mae Harper, just a little girl with borrowed shoes and unmatched socks, had unknowingly stepped into the spotlight of a world that wasn't ready for her, and one she might not be ready for either. By dawn, the next morning, the clip of Lily Mae Harper at the Bluegrass Civic Hall had become a digital wildfire no algorithm could contain. What had started as a casual stream from a borrowed smartphone had exploded into the top trending video across multiple platforms. The 10-second clip where Lily calmly tapped her clock after a sacrificial move that left chess experts blinking in disbelief had been reposted, remixed, slowed down, and analyzed frame by frame. TikTok dubbed it the checkmate stare. Instagram flooded with reaction reels of stunned chess influencers mouthing, "No way she saw that." Reddit threads ballooned with annotated diagrams breaking down her endgame like it was a historical artifact. Even Twitter, typically a battlefield of cynicism, paused long enough to marvel with one viral tweet reading, "She's 7. She's barefoot, and she's 4 steps ahead of the grown man across from her." Within 12 hours, the clip had been viewed over 18 million times. Celebrities shared it. Chess.com reposted it with the caption, "We'd lose to her happily." A Norwegian grandmaster called it pure instinct, married with precision. But beneath the fanfare, the questions began. Who was she? Where did she learn? Why wasn't she already sponsored or enrolled in an elite program? News outlets scrambled to find answers. By noon, local reporters were camped outside the Civic Hall, hoping to catch a glimpse of the girl in the faded pink sweater. One clip even showed a confused custodian waving them away. "She's gone. They left last night." Behind the scenes, email inboxes exploded, Caleb Whitaker's especially. Messages poured in from coaches, agents, sponsors, even talent scouts. A producer from Good Morning America reached out with, "We want the girl and her mother. Primetime slot. Full segment." A Silicon Valley VC offered a blank check to fund her education. But Caleb, watching the clip from his office in stunned silence, didn't move. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He only stared at the tiny figure on the screen, knowing something the world didn't. Lily didn't want to be found. And if the world came crashing down on her all at once, she might never return. For while the internet had fallen in love with the idea of a chess prodigy rising from obscurity, it hadn't yet realized the most brilliant minds are often the most fragile. And what Lily needed wasn't a spotlight, but a shield. By the end of the week, the question echoed across headlines, comment sections, breakfast tables, and boardrooms, who is this little girl? It was no longer just about a viral video or an extraordinary chess move. It had become a public obsession, a cultural riddle that no one could seem to answer. News anchors opened with grainy footage of the tournament hall and closed with speculation. Talk shows brought on child psychologists and chess masters to weigh in. Some believed she was the homeschooled daughter of a grandmaster in hiding. Others floated wilder theories that she was part of a secret government cognitive experiment or a savant raised off the grid. But none of the databases matched her name. No school enrollment, no official competition record, no tournament history. She was a ghost in the system, a genius without a paper trail. A few blurry photos emerged of her holding a juice box outside the Civic Hall, flanked by a woman presumed to be her mother, but neither figure had granted interviews or made any public statements. The mystery only deepened. Reddit detectives dissected the video, analyzing the logos on background posters, tracing every face in the audience to pinpoint geography and time. Someone zoomed in on Lily's faded pink sweater and claimed it was a Walmart brand from 5 seasons ago, proof that she was from a low-income household. Others noted how she moved not with the hyper-energy of a typical child, but with a deliberate stillness that suggested both caution and weight. The speculation turned political, then philosophical. Was society doing enough to reach kids like this? What if brilliance like hers existed all around us, but no one bothered to look? Meanwhile, at Whitaker Labs, whispers replaced work. Employees passed around the clip in meetings, each with their own theory. Caleb Whitaker remained silent, haunted not by the question of who she was, but what had been lost when she vanished. For him, Lily wasn't a curiosity. She was a child he had seen, however briefly, and failed to hold on to. The world now wanted to lift her up, but without knowing where she had come from or what she needed. And somewhere far from the noise behind a cracked door in a rented trailer on the edge of Ash Hollow, Lily sat cross-legged on the floor, piecing together a chess puzzle from memory, unaware that she had become a question the world was desperate to answer. The boardroom at Whitaker Labs had never felt colder than it did that morning. The long mahogany table stretched like a battlefield between Caleb and the members of the executive board, most notably Lorraine Benson, whose lips pressed into a thin, unreadable line. The clip of Lily playing chess had been projected moments earlier on the screen behind him, and although the footage only lasted 4 minutes, the fallout had brewed for days. "Let's not waste time pretending," Lorraine said, her voice smooth but sharp, slicing through the tension. "You brought a janitor's child into a corporate chess class, allowed her to mingle with staff, and now the entire internet thinks she's some kind of company protege. That's not just risky. It's opportunistic." Caleb didn't flinch. "She played one move. A perfect one. She didn't ask for attention. Neither did I. But the murmurs around the table only grew louder. Another board member, Victor Tran, chimed in. "This isn't about one move. It's about headlines. About you being hailed as the visionary who discovered the chess girl from the boiler room. Investors are calling. PR firms want interviews. Don't pretend you don't see the potential for brand leverage." "She's 7 years old," Caleb said, more to himself than to them. "She's not a mascot. She's a person." Lorraine's eyes narrowed. "Then act like it. Because right now the narrative is dangerously close to exploitation. A CEO using a poor little genius to soften his company's image after 3/4 of layoffs and a pending merger. It doesn't play well. I didn't plan any of this," Caleb said, and his voice cracked slightly. Not from weakness, but from something far closer to grief. She was standing in a hallway. She made one move. The world came after her, not the other way around. The room fell silent for a beat, but it was a silence of calculation, not empathy. "Intentions don't matter," Lorraine said finally. "Optics do. So unless you want to risk a scandal, you'll issue a statement soon. Say the company had no involvement. Say it was an error in judgment. And above all, distance yourself." Caleb looked down at the table where the reflection of Lily's tiny hand, moving a knight, still lingered on the paused screen behind him. He didn't respond. But in his silence, the lines were drawn. The boardroom had never seen this many eyes locked onto Caleb Whitaker at once. Not just from the long mahogany table where executives usually wielded quiet influence behind polished smiles, but from the back row too, where HR communications and finance teams stood packed shoulder to shoulder, drawn in by the cryptic company-wide memo he'd sent only hours before mandatory attendance. Clarity. 9:00 a.m. As the clock ticked over, Caleb stepped forward with no slides, no charts, just a folded piece of paper in his hands and the silent weight of resolve in his eyes. For a moment, the room held its breath. What started as a game of chess, he began, has turned into a question I can't ignore. What are we doing with the power we hold here, besides protecting ourselves? A ripple moved across the room like a breeze before a storm. Many of you have asked off-record and in whispers whether I exploited a child to humanize a corporate image. Let me answer you plainly. No, but I did something worse. I hesitated. When a child with no privilege, no tutors, and no pedigree showed she could see 12 moves ahead in her mind without blinking, I looked for permission. I waited for approval. I allowed the language of liability to almost silence the language of wonder. His voice didn't rise, but its steady rhythm drew the room inward. So today, I'm not here to defend a moment. I'm here to build a future. Effective immediately, Whitaker Labs will launch the Lily Initiative, a permanent scholarship and mentorship fund for children like her, those with brilliance in their bones but barriers at every gate. This initiative will provide not only educational scholarships, but also access to mentors' travel stipends for competitions, and most importantly, a seat at the table they were never invited to. Not just for chess, but for science, art, code, strategy fields, where talent too often goes unseen, because it doesn't wear the right shoes. Lorraine Benson shifted in her seat, but Caleb didn't pause. The fund will be seeded with an initial $5 million from my own holdings. Additional matching will come from redirected discretionary budgets and executive bonuses subject to a voluntary contribution vote by this board, which I hope you will support. And for those wondering, yes, it's named after Lily May Harper. Not to canonize her, but to remind us every single day what it means to notice someone, and what it costs not to. Silence again, but this time heavier, tangled with the stunned flickers of admiration, discomfort awakening. We can't undo a system that favors the already favored overnight, Caleb said finally, his voice gentler now, but we can start with a door. One small door opened wide. He looked up from his folded paper, folded it back into his pocket, and said quietly, "That's all." He didn't wait for applause. He simply stepped back, the name Lily still echoing in the room, not as a brand, but as a beginning. The room had barely begun to process Caleb's announcement when the sharp scrape of a leather chair filled the air like a warning shot. Lorraine Benson, vice chair of the board and guardian of what she liked to call institutional integrity, rose slowly with a folded stack of papers in her hand and an expression carved from granite. She didn't ask for permission to speak. She never had to. Her voice clipped and cold cut through the charged silence with surgical precision. "Mr. Whitaker," she began, "you speak of brilliance and justice and doors opened wide, but some of us here have a duty to ask the questions others won't. Questions that are inconvenient perhaps, but necessary when an entire company is suddenly being reshaped in the image of a child we knew nothing about until 2 weeks ago." Her gaze swept the room, locking eyes with executives who immediately looked away, and then fixed itself on Caleb with the subtle threat of a blade unsheathed. "You are proposing a multi-million-dollar initiative named after a child you happen to discover on company grounds, an unauthorized guest in an employee-only space who coincidentally is the daughter of one of our lowest-level janitorial staff. And while you speak of merit and wonder, I am compelled to raise a different possibility, impropriety." A wave of discomfort rustled through the boardroom, but Lorraine pressed on each word, polished and deliberate. "I am formally requesting a compliance review and internal investigation into the nature of your relationship with Ms. June Harper, the mother of this child, and whether any undue influence, personal bias, or favoritism has affected your decision-making in this matter. Given your personal financial investment in the Lily Initiative, your frequent one-on-one interactions with this family, and your failure to disclose any prior connection if one exists, I believe it is not only reasonable but essential to ensure that the public image of philanthropy is not masking a private agenda." Caleb's face remained unreadable, but a flicker of storm passed behind his eyes. Lorraine wasn't done. "And let us not forget the optics. A CEO with significant influence elevates a child with no application process, no background check, no verified records, and suddenly she becomes the face of a corporate scholarship program. Do you not see how that opens us to reputational risk, legal liability, and accusations of personal misconduct?" Her voice sharpened with every syllable. "You say this is about giving brilliance a chance. I ask whose brilliance and who decides. Because if the answer is simply you, then we've replaced a system with a monarchy." She paused, allowing the silence to settle like ash. "Until this matter is thoroughly reviewed by our Ethics and Oversight Committee, I motion to suspend the rollout of the Lily Initiative and freeze all associated funds." A few board members shifted uncomfortably. One or two nodded slightly. Lorraine saw it and pressed her advantage. This is not about one child. This is about governance. About protecting this company from narrative-driven decision-making that lacks transparency, precedent, and protocol. I will not sit quietly while we gamble the credibility of this institution on a viral clip and a vague speech. She returned to her seat, folding her papers like a judge sealing a verdict. Her eyes never left Caleb's. The challenge had been made public, personal, and merciless. And the storm she had summoned was only just beginning. The door opened not with drama, but with quiet purpose. Yet every head in the boardroom turned. June Harper stood at the threshold, not in a tailored suit or polished heels, but in the same worn work shoes and simple blouse she wore during night shifts, cleaning these very halls. She clutched no papers, brought no assistant, and made no apology for being there. Her eyes scanned the room, unwavering, then settled on Lorraine Benson. With a calm that surprised even herself, June stepped forward. "You wanted transparency," she said, her voice clear and steady, "so I came to offer it, not on Caleb's behalf, on mine." The boardroom shifted like a disturbed hive, but June didn't flinch. She moved to the center of the room, standing where countless executives had once pitched billion-dollar deals, and began to speak not with corporate jargon, but with human truth. "I'm June Harper, janitorial staff, mother of Lily Harper, the little girl who's suddenly become the subject of whispers, doubts, and accusations. I've heard what's being said, that this is favoritism, that there's something inappropriate between me and Mr. Whitaker, that somehow my daughter doesn't belong in the spaces she's walked into. So let me be painfully clear. Caleb Whitaker has never asked for anything from me except honesty. He has never crossed a line. He has only ever treated my daughter with the kind of dignity I didn't think existed in buildings like this." Her voice rose slightly. "You want to investigate our relationship? Fine. But the real relationship here is between opportunity and access, and that's what you're afraid of, isn't it? That a girl who never had a chance might suddenly have one, and that it didn't come wrapped in pedigree, legacy, or privilege?" Her eyes met Lorraine's. "You speak of governance and protocol. I speak of a little girl who taught herself to play chess by watching YouTube on a library computer while I worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on. I didn't ask for a scholarship program. I didn't ask for publicity. All I ever asked for her and for kids like her was a fair shot. Caleb offered that. And now you're trying to turn it into scandal." She looked around the room. "If what scares you is that people might begin to believe kids like Lily deserve more, then say that out loud. But don't hide behind compliance manuals and ethical reviews. Say what you mean. Or let a janitor say it for you." The room was still, and for the first time, silence didn't belong to the board. It belonged to her. June took a breath, steady but not soft, and let the weight of the room settle before she spoke again. "Let me say one more thing clearly, so there's no confusion." She began, her voice firm, yet strangely calm, like someone who had run out of fear and found something far stronger in its place. "I'm not here to beg for a seat at your table. I'm not here to plead for a favor or maneuver for some advantage. I'm not even asking you to like my daughter. I'm just asking that you don't become the first ones to fold at the sight of a move you didn't expect from a child who wasn't supposed to matter." Her eyes, tired but unbroken, scanned the table where men and women shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure how to respond to someone who wasn't playing by any of their rules. "I know how the world works," she continued. "People like you are used to spotting threats in tailored suits and strategic memos. You know how to prepare for a hostile takeover, a media scandal, a lawsuit. But what you're facing right now isn't any of those things. It's just a girl. A quiet little girl with a gift no one taught her, who walked into a room meant for professionals and made it her own with 9 moves and no apology. And instead of asking what that says about her brilliance, some of you are only asking how it happened without your permission." She took a small step forward. "You don't have to understand her. You don't even have to support her. But don't stand in her way because of your own discomfort. Don't teach the next generation that the moment a child from the wrong zip code makes the right move, the board flips over and the game ends. Because the truth is, this isn't about Lily. It's about whether you can handle the fact that the best player in the room might not look like what you're used to. She might not be from your schools, your country clubs, your legacy lists. She might just be a janitor's daughter who sees 12 steps ahead while you're still guarding your king. Then her voice softened, but her words hit harder. I'm not asking you to open the gates. I'm just asking you not to be the ones who lock them tighter. I'm not asking you to celebrate her. I'm just asking you not to be the first to be defeated, not by a scandal, not by a regulation, but by a single move from a poor little girl who saw the whole board when no one else was looking. The air in the boardroom thickened with a silence that wasn't emptiness. It was tension pulled taut, like the string of a bow just before release. June Harper, in her faded work shirt and scuffed shoes that had paced countless hallways with a mop in hand, stood at the center of a room lined with polished marble leather-backed chairs and people whose names appeared on donor walls and press releases. Her presence, uninvited and unsanctioned, was an act of defiance by its very nature. She did not shrink. She did not tremble. She did not ask to be heard. She made herself heard with the very act of standing there. Across from her sat Lorraine Benson, cloaked in years of authority layers of silk and the smug certainty of someone who had never once been questioned by a woman she deemed beneath her. Their eyes locked not as employer and employee, not even as rivals, but as symbols of two opposing worlds finally colliding in a room meant only for one of them. June's voice carried not just through the room but through decades of inherited silence, the kind that taught women like her to clean around the edges and leave no trace of their existence. But not today. Today, she became visible. Her every word, every breath was a challenge to the natural order of things, a quiet revolution unfolding between the potted plants and quarterly reports. Lorraine's lips pressed into a tight line, unused to resistance that wasn't couched in apology. The other board members shifted, not sure if they should intervene or observe, because what they were witnessing was something rare and raw, a moment when power was not just questioned but confronted by someone with no stake to lose. June, a mother, a janitor, a woman with nothing but truth in her voice, stood in a room calibrated to mute people like her, and she refused to be silenced. She didn't use legal terms or marketing strategy. She used conviction. She used love. And in that moment, the image of power itself began to warp. It wasn't Lorraine's pedigree or Caleb's title that held the room, it was June's refusal to bow. She wasn't arguing for a policy. She was demanding dignity. And in doing so, she forced everyone present to confront what they feared most, not scandal, not exposure, but a woman who had cleaned their offices for years, without being seen, now refusing to look away. The moment Lily Harper stepped onto the polished stage of the Kentucky State Youth Chess Championship, there was no doubt something extraordinary was about to unfold. Clad in a plain blue dress borrowed from a neighbor and clutching a well-worn pawn in her pocket like a talisman, she took her place across from the final opponent, an older boy from Louisville, groomed since age 5 by private tutors and elite clubs. The room brimmed with hushed tension, a mix of curiosity and skepticism about the girl who had risen from community center obscurity to the state finals in just a few weeks. Cameras flashed. Judges leaned forward. The clock began. Lily's eyes never left the board, her expression unreadable, her mind dancing 8 moves ahead like music only she could hear. Within 13 minutes, the crowd began to murmur. The boy hesitated, clearly thrown off by Lily's quiet audacity. Another 10 moves and the board tilted irrevocably in her favor. Then in a final calculated flurry, she sacrificed her bishop and whispered, "Checkmate," with the calmness of someone brushing hair behind her ear. Gasps erupted. Applause followed, hesitant at first, then thunderous. Lily Harper, a janitor's daughter, a girl once laughed at, for sweeping floors near executive offices, had become the Kentucky State champion. But the moment was larger than a trophy or a certificate. As she stood there, handshaken by judges and local officials, she became a symbol of something far deeper. The truth that brilliance recognizes no zip code. Cameras zoomed in on her solemn face, her mother's proud tears in the front row, and Mr. Caleb Dawson standing silently off to the side, his expression somewhere between pride and wonder. The next morning, local news stations led with her victory. Within hours, the story spread beyond the state. "Girl janitor beats state's best at chess," one headline read. Prodigy from the shadows, said another. But Lily paid no mind. For her, the victory was never about proving anything to the world. It was about proving to herself that the voice inside her, the one that moved through queens and pawns like poetry, had never lied. 2 weeks later, an official letter arrived. Sealed with the emblem of the U.S. Chess Federation, Lily Harper had been selected to represent Kentucky in the National Junior Chess Championship. Her name, once whispered in disbelief, was now printed on official scorecards. She didn't say much. She only looked at her mother, held the letter tight, and asked if she could bring her lucky pawn. The sun filtered gently through the old sycamore trees that lined the edge of the town's small park, casting soft dappled shadows across the wooden picnic table where 3 figures sat in quiet stillness. There was no ceremony, no press, no fanfare, just the faint rustle of wind through leaves, the distant laughter of children on the swings, and the familiar click of chess pieces meeting wood. Caleb, June, and Lily sat as if they had always belonged to this moment, a triangle of silence that needed no words to feel whole. The board between them was simple, worn smooth by time, and touch its squares slightly faded, but sacred now in a way no tournament hall could replicate. Lily sat in her usual pose, chin resting lightly in one palm, eyes scanning the board with quiet confidence, not as a competitor but as a child finally able to breathe. June sat across from her, her hands steady as she moved her pawn forward, not trying to win, not trying to test, but simply sharing the language her daughter understood best. Caleb observed. First, then joined in, not with strategy or ambition, but with the ease of someone who had learned that presence was more powerful than words. They rotated turns casually, the game flowing like conversation between hearts instead of voices. A rook captured here, a knight sacrificed there, but no one flinched, no one kept score. For the first time in weeks, perhaps months, there was no urgency, no proving, no watching eyes or whispered doubts, only the warmth of sunlight and the unspoken bond that had formed between a man who stayed, a woman who fought, and a girl who dreamed with pieces on a board. Around them the town moved slowly, cars passed in the distance, a dog barked near the sidewalk, and yet none of it touched the piece nestled beneath that tree. June glanced up at one point, her eyes meeting Caleb's, and in that moment there was recognition not of debts or promises, but of something gentler, something that didn't need definition. Lily smiled faintly as she trapped a bishop, her fingers brushing the edge of the table, grounding herself not in victory, but in the rare stillness of being exactly where she was meant to be. The game would end eventually, the sun would dip lower, and the world would call them back into its noise, but for now, the board held them together like a quiet promise that no matter what came next, they had this moment, this pause, this unspoken checkmate of belonging. In the quiet that followed the final move on the chessboard, as the long Kentucky evening stretched its golden fingers across the park, and the breeze rustled through the sycamore leaves like the turning pages of a story, nearly finished, something deeper settled into place, not just among the 3 at the table, but in the unspoken spaces between their hearts. Caleb looked at Lily and saw not a prodigy or a symbol or a miracle, but simply a child, brilliant, yes, but also fragile in the way all children are, hoping that the people who reach for them won't let go halfway. He glanced at June. Her shoulders eased for the first time in what felt like years, and he understood in that moment what true presence meant. Presence. It wasn't about showing up with grand gestures or promises. It was about staying, especially when things got hard, especially when the board didn't favor your side, especially when walking away would be easier. That he realized was what June had done every day of Lily's life. She had stayed when the world didn't. She had stayed through shifts that left her too tired to stand, stayed through stares and whispers, stayed through the pain of watching her daughter carry genius in a world that often didn't know what to do with it. And now slowly, Caleb was learning to stay too. Not out of guilt or redemption, but because he had come to see that the truest victories were not won in conference rooms or news headlines, but in quiet parks around chipped chessboards, beside people who knew your scars and chose you anyway. The journey that had begun with a barefoot girl solving puzzles on a tiled floor had become something much larger, Not a story of exceptional talent, but of exceptional love. And as the shadows grew longer and the last light of day held them in its soft embrace, a thought rose gently to the surface unspoken, but understood among all three, that family was not defined by blood or name or circumstance, but by this simple truth. Family is where no one leaves you halfway, even when the game looks lost. Family is where someone sits beside you, even when they don't know the next move and says, "I'm here." Family is not built on perfection or performance, but on the promise that losing does not make you less worthy of love. And so, with the pieces resting quietly on the board and the game now forgotten, the story closed not with a final victory, but with a vow. Because in the end, family is the place where no one walks away in the middle, even if they're losing, especially if they're losing. Sometimes the most powerful stories aren't the ones filled with noise or glory, but the quiet ones where love is shown not through words, but through presence. This story reminds us of a simple but profound truth. Children don't just need opportunities, they need people who stay. In a world obsessed with success, we often overlook the value of showing up consistently for our kids, our friends, and even ourselves. Lily didn't win because someone handed her a shortcut. She won because her mother believed in her every single day, even when the world didn't. And Caleb's redemption didn't come from money or power, it came from sitting down beside a little girl and not walking away. In real life, we often face moments when it's easier to give up, especially when things get messy or uncertain. But what if the most life-changing thing you could do was simply to stay? Stay with someone who's struggling. Stay in a conversation that matters. Stay through the uncomfortable parts, because that's where real connection is born. The people who change lives aren't always the loudest or the richest. They're the ones who are still there when everyone else leaves. So if you've ever wondered whether your presence matters, whether staying one more day, one more conversation, one more step is enough, let this story be your answer. It is. You don't need to fix everything. You just need to not leave in the middle. What does family mean to you? Have you ever had someone stay even when things got hard? Share your story in the comments, we'd love to hear it. Don't forget to save this video to revisit the lesson and subscribe for more heart-touching stories like this one. Your presence here matters too.